Most bankers aren't ready to help you until after their third cup of coffee. But with Central National Bank's after-hours service, you don't have to wait for the bank lobby to open to get help. You can contact us from 6 to 8:30 in the morning or from 5 to 10 in the evening, and we'll connect you to a real, live, local person who can answer questions and fix problems 7 days a week. Bank different. Bank Central. Central National Bank. Member FDIC.
Hey, Blazer fans. We are talking with Caitlin Cooper today. Caitlin is a writer and editor for Indy Cornrows, which is the SB Nation site all about the Indiana Pacers. Dan and I are going to try to introduce a little bit of sort of team-specific content for people who want to go a little bit deeper on some of our upcoming opponents. So we're going to do that with the Pacers today. The Blazers are getting ready to take on the Pacers on Thursday, January 18th. And we want to get to know the other team a little bit and find out a little bit more about what to expect this matchup. So Caitlin, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you today.
Hey, I'm glad to be on.
Awesome. Well, so you had a big offseason over there in Indianapolis.
What's that like?
The team yeah, it felt a little familiar to some of us. How's the team adapted to the big changes that occurred over the summer?
Well, I think, it's pretty easy because of what Paul George did what he did, instead of the Pacers getting a ghostwritten letter and like the Players Tribune, it's a little bit easier to accept it when they got Oladipo, who looks like he's going to be having his first trip to the All-Star game here in a couple of weeks. So I think the adjustment has been fairly smooth because overall, like Victor Oladipo's just endeared himself, I think, to the city in a way that maybe Paul George never really did. He kind of wore his affinity for Los Angeles on his sleeve. Even, he competed as best he could for the Pacers, but you always knew that there was that longing that, he wanted to be in LA. And with Victor, he already has his signature celebration. He calls this place home. He played his college basketball in Indiana. So I think the adjustment period was pretty quick.
So how has the basketball changed now?
Well, I think overall, especially just Victor himself, that they started out, they were playing pretty quick, the pace. I mean, their very first game of the year was historically fast. They had 116 possessions in that game against the Nets. And so since then, though, they've slowed down. They're down, I think the last I looked, they're about at 17th in pace, but Victor himself is like a one-man wrecking crew in transition. And I think just differences just between him and Paul George. Victor's replaced his scoring prowess. He scored 15 or more points in every game but 2. So in that regard, he's almost been a little bit more consistent than Paul George. But defensively, they would use Paul George, like you guys might even remember this. They'll put him on anyone from Damian Lillard to LeBron James and be like, oh, Paul George, go be a stopper. And with Victor, they'll put Bojan Bogdanovic and hope that he can kind of hold his head above water against the other team's best defender, just because Victor's so good at playing in the gaps and roaming passing lanes. And the Pacers are at their best when they're scoring points off turnovers. So that's definitely something you want to look for when they play the Blazers.
Dan, I know that you're a big fan of Oladipo. Do you have any specific questions you want to ask about how things are going with him?
Yeah, I mean, Oladipo's been quietly one of my favorite guys in the league, and I always thought that, like another Indiana product in Noah Vonleh, it was about being in the right place at the right time and kind of having it all come together. What is it about the Pacers that has unlocked what two previous coaches and staffs couldn't unlock with him?
Right. I think the biggest difference maybe, a lot of people talk about Russell Westbrook, and Russell was averaging over 90 touches last year. And now he plays next to Darren Collison, who's used to sliding off ball, and Darren's at, right around 70 touches. So with the ball in Victor's hands more, he can get to the rim. He can draw free throws, and that's been a big part of it. But I also think even ignoring the personnel changes, just looking at Victor, he's slimmed down, he's quicker, his overall body transformation, just his control of his athleticism. Anytime he gets in a dribble handoff situation, kind of his signature move is going between the legs and then taking a step back jumper, and he's just so smooth at that. I mean, there's been opponents, like I talked about it when they played Oklahoma City. Andre Robertson was checking him, and he would consistently have to go under screens to stay in front of him, and Victor, with that much space, was still able to beat him to the rim. And that's an all caliber, all defensive player. So it's just been really fun to watch his overall development versus where he's been in his last 2 stops and how he's kind of put it all together.
So for Portland fans that aren't aware, the Pacers head coach is former Trailblazers head coach Nate McMillan. I know the Pacers are a small market like Portland, and if you're not paying attention to these things, they kind of get glanced over. And something we were talking about before we started recording, Mike Prada, also an SB Nation guy, has taken to calling the Pacers the Blazers East. And we're not talking about the current iteration of the Blazers. We're talking about a previous iteration of the Blazers. What are the comparisons that you see? I mean, outside of the fact that Nate McMillan is there, Kevin Pritchard is there, Chad Buchanan is there, the play style, the roster formation. Like, what are the things that you're noticing that kind of harken back to the same kind of the style that the previous Blazers generation had?
Right. I mean, I think when you look back at a lot of Nate McMillan's teams, with last season, his first with the Pacers kind of being an outlier there, the offense was generally pretty good, but they never really played fast, and that's kind of holding true again this year. They started out really fast, like I mentioned earlier, and now they're playing slower, but their half-court offense overall has been an improvement over when Frank Vogel was here at the beginning of this half of the season. And, just Myles Turner being a comparison to LaMarcus. Myles he's kind of had stagnant year-over-year growth this year as far as being able to take advantage over smaller players in the post, which isn't really a direct comparison to LaMarcus, but just being two young bigs who could shoot the ball out of Texas. A lot of people make those comparisons. And then, some people have kind of made some comparisons to Victor and Brandon Roy. And, Brandon was more about, and you guys might differ on this. Obviously, you watched him a lot more than I did. But he was really, what he excelled at was kind of setting his own pace and being able to create space for himself. And while Victor's kind of more of a turbo, putting the jets on, you can see some development with Victor and how he's using, like I mentioned, his handle just to create space against opponents, and some of his really almost absurd finishes he's had at the rim. You could practically have a power rankings of some of the layup finishes he has. So, yeah, there's just a lot of comparisons there with how many people that were once in Portland are now in Indiana. I think I made a joke over the summer that eventually maybe they'll hire Greg Oden as some sort of player development coach.
It hurts.
He's also an Indiana native, is he not?
Right, yeah.
So, the ties between Indiana and the Trailblazers here are going pretty deep. And, you're spot on. You honestly put a huge smile on my face when you described Brandon Roy's game. The ability to dictate pace and tempo within the half court and create space. That's honestly the perfect way to describe Brandon Roy, in my opinion. You touched on Myles Turner, and something I want to ask about, particular to this matchup. When I look at Myles Turner's box score, both his traditional and his advanced numbers, everything about him screams like he should be doing more. Like, when I look at his stats, he's putting up 14 and 7 basically. His shooting looks good. The time on the court looks good. But when I look at his attempts, him, Sabonis, Darren Collison, Bogdan are all right around the same spot, and Thaddeus Young. In the hierarchy of the team, should Turner be featuring more? Should he be that clear-cut number 2 guy, or are they a better team when they kind of do this by committee?
Right. That's been a real sticking point around Pacers Twitter, I think, because like in the fourth quarter, there's certain fourth quarters where he kind of gets frozen out. I think he has over 10 fourth quarters where he hasn't even attempted more than 2 shots. And his touches, there's 15 starting centers having more touches per game than him. Some of it's a function of the offense, because Nate McMillan runs so much heavy pick and roll offense, spread pick and roll, and his mid-range shot is so important to that. I think he's right now the top mid-range shooter in the NBA per, I forget how many attempts, but it's so important to that because opponents go out to guard him. That's how they generate a lot of their corner threes. So to a certain extent, they've pigeonholed him a little bit as a jump shooter, but then there's also the part where he, on his own part, his growth kind of stagnated over the summer, where I'm not sure how comfortable they really feel all the time throwing it to him in the post, like I said before, because he tends to settle for turnaround jump shots predominantly over his right shoulder, even when he gets switched on to guys like James Harden. So his scoring arsenal hasn't diversified enough where I'm not quite sure they're ready to give him the ball more, but for the overall trajectory of the team, I think most people hope that he would be touching the ball more than he is right now, and that's a little bit of a matter of concern, as you mentioned.
So one of the questions I have are what are sort of some of the hallmarks of this new team that we as Blazer fans can keep an eye on when these two teams match up?
Right. I think definitely at the beginning of the game, watch to see how active the Pacers are on defense. And what I mean by active is how much are they hounding the passing lanes? Are they denying dribble? Are they denying dribble handoff passes? Because overall, they're not a good defensive team. Like, they allow opponents to shoot a lot of 3-point attempts, and they're near the bottom in points in the paint. But when they're in those passing lanes and they can force turnovers, like I talked about, that's when they're at their best, because they're like 2-12. I looked up this number today. They're 2-12 when they don't outscore their opponent in points off turnovers. So it's not a guarantee that they'll win when they do that, but it's a pretty close to guarantee that they're going to be in trouble if they don't. And the first time these teams met up, Portland outscored them 23-10 in that battle. And Myles Turner was out in that game. So I think another thing that you definitely want to watch is the pick and roll coverage, because the Pacers aren't really good at defending the roll man, which means Nurkic could have a pretty decent game depending upon how they defend Lillard. And, Lillard's so good at hitting those pull-up threes off the dribble. So Myles is probably going to get pulled further from the basket to hedge there. And he has a little bit of trouble in those 2-on-1 situations when he has to defend the roll man and the guard. So you might want to see how they handle Nurkic and if Myles can hit those shots. I mean, right now he's still out with a wrist injury, so by Thursday he might not be in the lineup. So that's another thing that could be a big determining factor.
So with all again, back to the changes that took place on the offseason, when LaMarcus Aldridge left Portland, they kind of threw together this whole brand new cast. And a lot of people felt like that team went on to overachieve, behind Damian Lillard. How do you feel like the Pacers have been doing this year, considering such a big piece went away? Do you feel like they're achieving right on? Do you think they're overachieving with a little chip on their shoulder because, they didn't have Paul George anymore? How are things going in that respect?
Oh, I think they far exceeded everybody's expectations. I think at the beginning of the year, I would have been really surprised if they made the playoffs or even been in, right now they're in 8th. I would have been surprised if that would have happened at any point in the season, just because I expected the defense to have such a drop off. And the defense is still, like I said, pretty porous, but offensively they've made enough of a jump that the offense has been better this year than it was last year, even with Paul George in the lineup, simply because they have more shooters. I mean, last year's roster, I think the Pacers had 6 players on last year's roster who are no longer even in the NBA anymore.
Wow.
And, like Monte Ellis, for instance, like last year in the playoffs, Paul George was constantly facing double teams and getting overloaded on because Monte had injuries, and it just became kind of sad with him, and they just ignore him in the corner. Like, they just use Kevin Love or LeBron to roam off of him. And now this year, it's a lot harder to do that against Victor Oladipo because they have Bogdanovich out there. They have Darren Collison. They just have more people that can shoot. They don't take a lot of threes, but they take high-quality ones, and it makes it harder for teams to do that, though I think some teams are starting to hard show on Victor a little bit more than they were at the start of the season.
Now, we're talking about the Pacers being Blazers East, and we've gotten this far without actually mentioning a direct lineage Blazer in Baby Sabonis and Demonis. Obviously, Victor's getting all the pub because of his play. I mean, the numbers he's putting up are no joke, Brandon Roy-esque, 24, 5, and 5, or those are Hall of Fame caliber numbers if you're able to put those up for a run of years. So if Oladipo is in fact this player, he's on his way. But Sabonis has quietly been huge in the sense of, again, getting the opportunity to play somewhere and capitalize on it. He's just short of a double-double. How much has he meant to this team on both sides of the floor, and where do you and the Pacers fans in general, where do you guys kind of see him fitting into this team going forward?
Right. So, I mean, he's a very intuitive screen setter, and, he's not his dad, but he's also a very polished passer. At one point, I think behind Darren Collison, he was assisting on more threes than anybody on the roster. And from going from OKC to here, instead of being kind of a makeshift spread four like he was for the Thunder, the Pacers have allowed him to play 5, and it's really just having him be more purposely involved in the action. He's really blossomed. And Myles Turner's missed games with a concussion and now a wrist injury, and he's been a starter, and they haven't necessarily missed too much of a beat. They miss Myles' shooting when he's out, but Sabonis can impact a game in ways that Myles really can't when his shot doesn't fall. And I think long term they have to look at, can those two play together? And not too much self-promotion here, but I have a story on that pinned on my tweet where I kind of looked into that. And I think some of it will depend on Nate McMillan, because right now they play together in really small bursts. And the offense isn't all that imaginative when they're both playing. They could be running more horn sets and other, high-low action, and they kind of stick with their normal stuff even when the two of them are in the game, which is a bit of a problem because neither of them can really close out on shooters if the opposing team is small. But, I think the future's bright with him. I think people didn't expect, no pun intended, but he's definitely been a Sabonis.
Oh, man. That pun was totally intended.
Yep. Yeah, it was. I admit it.
Also, self-promotion is totally okay because you write some really great pieces.
Always allowed.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe you could take just a minute or two to tell us a little bit about the work that you do with Indy Cornrows and kind of what your favorite things to write about are and talk about with the Pacers.
Right. So I like to do a lot of the kind of play analysis breakdowns, and like that piece I just mentioned was probably, that one was close to me because that was actually the 450th article that I did at Indy Cornrows, and kind of did that for a Black Friday article. So if people want to get a little bit sneak peek of some of the stuff I do, I think that's a pretty good one to look at. I just like looking at play sets because I don't report directly from the arena. I think watching the games, you can break that down a little bit easier when you don't necessarily have the context from what the players have said about the games. And so, yeah.
Have you had a chance to watch much film with the Trailblazers and their play sets, and do any of them really stand out to you?
Right. So I'm actually a little bit interested to hear this from you guys. Like the offense, I'm very surprised that Portland's defense is what it is this year. Like I didn't expect, Lillard and McCollum to be able to, for both of them to be in a lineup for the defense to be better, but it seems like the offense has taken a drop off. I watched them play the Bulls when Lillard was out, and I watched them play who was it this past week? But the offense doesn't quite seem like it's functioning to the same extent that it was last year. It seemed a little bit more imaginative with some of the flare screens and drift sets they would use. Is that just because they have Evan Turner and Amino in the starting lineup, so they don't have as much shooting, or what do you guys?
Dan, you go ahead. Dan, you go ahead.
That's the crux of the issue is that where a few years ago Portland had the market cornered on shooting, they really only have two. I think you can safely say three now. Aminu's actually, I think, to the point where he's demonstrated he's effective enough as a floor spacer that you can't leave him. But Portland still features Maurice Harkless and Evan Turner. Harkless less so this year, but there's too many negative floor spacers on the team for the dribble handoffs and the flow offense, the pistol action, all that stuff to really get the looks that Portland's gotten in the past.
I would say it was super crowded at the beginning of the season before people started to spend a little bit more time paying attention to Aminu and Pat Connaughton. They now demand a little bit more attention, so there's a little bit more room. So that probably contributes some, I think.
No, I think you're spot on.
I don't know.
That's as far as gravity goes. Those guys are opening things up a bit more, and something Tara and I were talking about before we hopped on with you is that over the last since the beginning of the year, really, Portland's offense is a top 5 unit, while their defense has dropped back down to the bottom third. And that's
which is exactly opposite of what it was at the beginning of the season.
And a lot of that is due to, and it's not because Damian Lillard is out, because there are people here who think that the team is a better team without Damian Lillard, in which point I will say you are crazy and I will absolutely devalue anything that you say at that point. But there are guys that are forced to step up. Maurice Harkless, who was a negative contributor for the vast majority of the season, is 11 of 19 from three since Dame went down. Like a guy who was a negative shooter is now shooting over 50% from three, with enough volume to justify a defender not having both feet in the paint. I mean, there were times earlier this season where I'll always go back to this example because it's kind of burned into my head. The Blazers are on a road trip in Philadelphia, and Evan Turner's in one corner, Maurice Harkless is in the other. Ben Simmons is, quote-unquote, guarding Evan Turner with 1 foot in the paint. Mm-hmm. There's no world that exists where Damian Lillard or CJ McCollum can be effective, where there's 4 guys basically playing, a box and one on Damian Lillard. There's no amount of talent that allows that to excel, and to see that role reversed just by the sheer fact that they are knocking down shots is a little bit encouraging.
And I think one of the other things that Portland has seen more recently is the emergence of Shabazz Napier, which reminds me of another question for you, Caitlin. Who are some of the maybe lesser known players on the Pacers that, people close to the team really know and love really well, but some people outside of the area might not know as much and that we should watch for?
Well, Lance Stevenson's pretty beloved. I mean, he's just always doing crazy stuff. But like here in this last game against the Cavs, you kind of see what his value can be outside of the LeBron stuff, like just being able to get into the paint. He's so strong and he can finish at the rim, and just his rebounding. He's just a big fan favorite. And then recently, I think you have to give Corey Joseph some attention because they really, like I said earlier, they really struggle to defend the pick and roll, and Darren Collison is part of that because he just kind of dies on some of those screens. And Corey Joseph is a little bit, Corey Joseph is a little bit of the opposite of that, where, he has enough size where they can switch, and he's pretty decent at fighting over screens. Sometimes opponents will even set illegal screens whenever he's out there because he really fights over the top. And when you look at the on-off differences whenever he's in the starting, when he plays with the starters versus when Darren does, I think they only are allowing like 98 points when Corey Joseph is in the lineup. So I don't think he's gotten enough attention here. So I'm sure people in Portland probably wouldn't have known much about that. And then I think also Bogdanović, he hasn't shot the ball real well here of late, but he is a big factor in their movement in the half court, just coming off curl cuts. When he can't make a three, then he can get to the rim with those, and some of the other stuff they run off pin downs, and that they didn't necessarily have last year when they didn't have so many shooters that were capable of doing that. It's just crazy how much both teams have changed, because Portland's kind of been a house of horrors for the Pacers the last several years. I looked up this morning. They haven't won in Portland since 2007-08 when Nate McMillan was still coaching. Yeah. And a lot of those matchups, they were hanging like 120 plus points on the Pacers, because I just remember how many threes they rain in. A lot of the time the Pacers have been on back-to-backs when they get into Portland, coming like out of LA because they're on West Coast road trips. So they've usually have had a lot of trouble defending them. So we'll see how that goes now that, it's Evan Turner and some of your other negative spacers.
Well, and those are the games Paul George has had during that period. Paul George had some of his best career games on the road in Portland.
Oh, yeah, that 43-point game is definitely high on his list. That's probably one of my favorite games he played as a Pacer.
He took over the entire fourth quarter. I was sitting there at the game going, good God, he's going to win this game single-handedly. I mean, that kind of puts in perspective how good Portland has played versus the Pacers on their home floor, which, I don't know how closely he followed Portland at home this year. That's not necessarily a given this year.
Definitely. Yeah. I have one last quick question, but Dan, if you want to follow it up with another one, but I just remembered that Evan Turner did spend like a half a season in Indiana.
Oh, yes.
And one of my theories that Dan and I were talking about earlier is that Evan Turner is somebody who needs time to adjust when he comes into a new situation. What do you recall from that short stint that Turner spent in Indiana?
Well, fans here don't remember it that particularly fondly. I think part of it is because it was an unpopular trade to begin with, because Evan Turner got here via them trading Danny Granger, who didn't look like he had much left to give at that point. But Paul George had a really close relationship with Danny, and a lot of the people in the locker room did, and there was questions at that point of what's going to happen with the chemistry when he goes, and then Evan gets here, and with the type of offense they were running at the time, they had Roy Hibbert and David West in the paint, and a lot of Evan's offense is that back down, hit the turnaround jump shot from the mid-post area, and there really wasn't a spot for him to thrive doing that, and they didn't play up-tempo. So for him to get to the rim, it just really was – he was kind of just a sore thumb, and then defensively he was a net negative a lot during that time. So Frank Vogel actually didn't play him that much in the time that he was here to see, like kind of what you're saying, like – if he needed more time to gel, that wasn't going to happen that late in the season when the Pacers were up there trying to go back and forth with the Miami Heat. And I mean, he didn't even really play in that series when they were in the Eastern Conference Finals just because the fit was so awkward. And so, yeah, a lot of fans are not too big of fans of Evan Turner here in Indiana.
Yeah. Dan, do you have any more questions?
No, I think we pretty much hit on the things that I really wanted to touch on. The Oladipo love is going to be there. The Myles Turner love is going to be there.
I'm definitely going to be watching for disrupting the passing lanes. That's a really good, easy thing for me to keep an eye out for, to kind of whether or not they're being successful.
To kind of keep this thread going from something we've discussed over the past couple of weeks, are Pacers fans happy? And this is kind of a subjective question. Are they happy that the team is perhaps playing better than expected, as opposed to quasi-tanking, if that makes sense?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. We had to write these, I just wrote this mid-season review that questioning that exact thing. It was, does it matter if this team's the 2013-14 Phoenix Suns that kind of exceeded expectations, and then the next year after they won 48 wins, they only won like 35. So, like, how much of this is a mirage? And, you know, if the choice was between whether Oladipo and Sabonis blossom and they get an 8 seed, or they just miss the playoffs, versus they're bad and Oladipo and Sabonis don't blossom, knowing what I know now, I would be happy if they got an 8 seed and Victor is what Victor is. Like, I'm not sure at the beginning of the season that would have been my opinion, because I don't think I knew that Victor was capable of what he's doing.
Of being this good.
To this degree. Right.
There's a difference between great and good.
Right. If he's this all-star caliber player that has this control of his athleticism, that can hit pull-up threes, that can set the pace in transition, and that can draw fouls at the rim, then it's all right if they don't get a good draft pick. Like, at the beginning of the season, seeing what he was in OKC and where he was at, my opinion of that probably would have been the reverse, that I would have preferred that, hey, you know, if they get a decent pick, it's all right that they have these two players, and maybe they'll be okay. And, you know, but that would be my opinion. And I'm not sure how much of what the Pacers have done this year is necessarily real, just because they still really rely on mid-range shots and their defense isn't great. So on nights when they can't make the few high-quality threes that they do make, sometimes they're in battles of, you know, trying to win with making long twos, which isn't mathematically going to work out for them. So there's a chance that some of this hasn't been real, and they just thrive on the improbable right now with all these comebacks they keep having, like they just did against the Cavs in that 22-point comeback. So, you know, by next year, maybe this isn't what the team is, but I think that Victor Oladipo really is what he's been showing at the first half of this season. So,
do you think in part that comes from the fact that basically the 6 most valuable players on this roster, give or take, are all 25 and younger?
Right. I mean, that's big. Just like the other night, they were talking about that during the Cleveland Pacer game, because, you know, Cleveland's roster is a little bit older. You know, their bench. A little bit. Yeah, just a little bit. You know, they got Kyle Korver out there versus, you know, the Pacers, like you just said. You know, their bench is Corey Joseph and Lance Stevenson and Sabonis and TJ Leaf, who's 19 a lot of the time. So,
wow.
Yeah, no, I think there's a stark contrast when people talk about how young Portland is versus how young a team like the Pacers are. Because if you look at the Pacers, their age is going to be skewed by 38-year-old Damian Wilkins, 33-year-old Al Jefferson, 30-year-old Darren Collison, 30-year-old Thaddeus Young. The guys that are going to be important to this franchise going forward, you said Leaf's 19 or just turned 20. Sabonis is 21. Right. Myles Turner, although it feels like he's been in the league for 5 years, is 21. Oladipo just turned 25. Like, this is a team that is still 3 years away from, having their core guys right now in their prime. And I think that's a difference between Portland, who has Nurkic, who's quote unquote already 24, going on 25. Dame's 25, 26. CJ's 25, 26. Like, there's a difference between the youth that the Pacers have and the youth that the Blazers have. Not that the Blazers by any means old. I think it's just a different type of age when you're talking about developing on an NBA life cycle.
Well, right, because just like you said, I mean, Al Jefferson isn't even in their normal rotation unless, Myles or Sabonis is out. They waived Damian Wilkins here this week. And, and even with Thad and Darren Collison and Bogdanovich, like you said, there's a good chance those players aren't in their long-term future. I mean, 2 of them have partially guaranteed contracts that they could potentially shop at the trade deadline or at the end of the year, depending upon what they think the direction of the team is. So their core is definitely young and ready to continue growing together, I think.
Well, this has been super great to hear all these inside scoop about what to look for the Pacers. Just to mention, Dan, that Nurkic just turned 23 in August, so he's like 23 and a half.
Okay.
But yeah, so that about does it. Caitlin, do you want to tell folks how to find your stuff on social media and on the internet?
Right. Twitter, I'm at C2_Cooper. And then if you just head over to Indy Cornrows, you can usually see my stuff several times a week. So hope that some of the Portland readers will want to check some of that out, especially this week when they see each other on Thursday. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate
thanks
it.
for having me.
Okay, that was cool. We've never done that before. And I'm like